Should you get an LLC to own rental properties? As an investor, this is a normal question because you want to protect the wealth that you've built. I've got nothing against LLCs and use them myself, but what if I told you there were other ways, much simpler and less expensive, that you might want to consider first? This episode is a conversation with experienced investor and author John Schaub. And by the end, you're going to learn 7 simple ways to reduce the risk that you take as a real estate investor. Now, because of the nature of this topic, I want to say up front that neither of us are giving you legal advice. This conversation is for educational purposes, to get you thinking. And both John and I hire our own legal and tax professionals to help us out with these topics. And we recommend you do the same. So with that said, let's get started. Last year at an event, you spoke and you said something that surprised me. And after 20 years, I was surprised I heard something new. And you said something about when you self-manage your properties, or you're a small and mighty investor, like a lot of people listening to this, that often using the complex asset protection strategies like having an LLC and doing a lot of these other formations might not even protect you. And I was wondering if you could unpack that a little bit for me and help me understand what you meant by that.
Sure. Well, let me just kind of do a disclaimer to start with that I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not giving legal advice here. And before you transfer any of your properties to an LLC or a corporation or trust or anything else, you need to get legal advice. And I know most investors are like me when I started. You hate to write that check to a lawyer. I happen to be married to one. So for 45 years, Valerie and I have been married and been partners in our business. And she was top of her class, and she's a good lawyer, and she knows a lot of lawyers. So we have over the years learned a lot about asset protection. But I want to talk today about just a lot of common sense things that you can do without calling your lawyer that'll keep you from having problems. I will tell you, and this is not bragging, I don't want to jinx myself here, but in all the tenants we've had and all the properties we've owned, which are many, we've never had anybody sue us for anything. I think that the greatest risk that most landlords have is not probably from tenants, but we'll talk about maybe how to reduce some of that. But the primary risk you have really is when you go to borrow money and you can't pay it back. You find 90% of the people that lose something lose it because they can't repay a loan that they've taken out. So we'll get to that a little bit later. But talking about just some common sense things you can do, the more interaction you have with people, the more people that you deal with, be it buyers, sellers, contractors, tenants, whoever, the more likely you are to have a problem someday. And when I ask people what kind of problems they've had and get a show of hands in classes, typically the problems come from either partnerships, where two people own something together or manage it together, or maybe they were married and they had to split things up. So partnerships, when you have more than one partner, and when I first started, I thought that was a good idea, but I quickly learned that having a whole bunch of partners was not a good idea. And I'm talking about like 5 guys in one deal. So I learned to deal with investors, and I've always used investor money to buy property. But I always go with just one-on-one. So just one investor and me, and for a lot of reasons. But number one is I control the deal. If you invest with me, and I'm not looking for investors, so this is not a solicitation. But I go out and find the property. I buy the property. I manage the property. I sell the property. All you get to do is write a check in the beginning and get a check back, probably while we own it, and then another check when we sell it. But I'm not looking for a lot of advice.
This is like a person. It's like a person who sits co-pilot with you and you're flying the plane, right? It's like don't touch my instruments. I'm in control of this plane, right?
Yeah. There's only one guy in charge, right? And I won't say I'm a control freak, but I think most of us invest in real estate because we like the sense of control we have. We can do things. We can make things happen. We can choose who to rent to. We can choose who to hire to repair things. We can choose which property to buy. And all those things directly affect the risk you have. So to start with the basics, if you buy a property that is going to have some excitement. If you buy a little shopping center and there's hundreds of people walking through it every day, or an apartment building where you have people moving in and out a lot, or I'm on a motel where people come and go all the time, that obviously increases your chances of having a problem of some kind. So if you can have a strategy to do as little volume as possible, if you could just buy one property with one tenant and that's all you ever did, there's chances of you having a problem are really low. But most of us are going to end up with many properties, and I own a number of properties and have a number of tenants. So now it's a decision-making process. Which ones do you want to buy? And that's why I stick with houses now, and I've owned a lot of different kinds of properties. But the houses I own are rented to people who like my houses. They like me because I do a good job managing, with things, which means when something breaks, we fix it. It's pretty simple once you get them in there. But if you do those things, if you keep the house in good shape and it's a decent house in a good neighborhood, people don't want to move. They don't want to. They're not going to get mad at you. By selecting the type of property to buy, you eliminate a lot of your risk. Okay, so that doesn't. Go ahead.
Yeah, I'd say that the first takeaway, if I had to summarize it as you're saying all this, because I think there's so many gems in there. One of those is being a buy one house at a time type investor, which was the name of your book, or be a small mighty investor. There's some benefits just from a risk standpoint. And I want to talk in a second about what we actually are worried about, what kind of risk we're talking about. Yeah. But what I'm hearing you say is just being smaller, doing fewer transactions, doing less complicated deals, buying houses. Just the simplicity of your business model itself has a big influence on whether you're putting yourself at risk versus not putting yourself at risk, right? That's my first takeaway I'm hearing. And then the other one that I've heard you say at the event last year, which is really interesting, is that a lot of us are self-managing our properties. Mm-hmm. We're actually not hiring. Some people hire third-party managers and do it long distance, but many of us are very involved in our business. And so I wonder what for those of us who are doing that, like having these separate entities and LLCs, and this is, again, I'm not an attorney either, but I think it's an interesting conversation to talk to your attorney about whether it's worth me going to all the trouble of having a bunch of layers of entities if I'm the one managing it myself. I mean, do you have a thought on that or an opinion on that?
Yeah, let's just back up a little bit. I mean, if you've most of you have probably either been solicited by or seen ads for people who have asset protection strategies. My fellow I share office space with, who is a retired dental surgeon, he's made a lot of money. Years ago, when I first met him, he had just paid $10,000 to an out-of-state attorney, I won't mention anybody's name, for this asset protection plan, that he could implement and have bulletproof asset protection. So he looks at it, and it's a stack of papers like 300 pages deep, and he doesn't know what to do with the darn thing. So he spends the $10,000, and he goes to a local lawyer and says, I've got all this stuff. I want you to make it work. And after a couple hours, the lawyer says, I wouldn't use any of that stuff. So here's problem number one. You can't really do your own legal work. You might think you can, but to do it effectively is taking a risk. And it's a mistake that if you think you have asset protection, but you don't, that's the worst possible situation to be in, right? Because now, you're getting involved in transactions that put you at risk, and you don't know it. So to your point, if I had all my properties in an offshore trust at a corporation in 4 different layers and nobody could get to them, but I was the guy who collected the rent, and I was the guy who selected the tenants, and I was the guy who hired the plumber to go out, I, again, picked up some personal liability. And you'll hear people say that they're judgment proof, and that's probably a stretch, and it's hard to do. I mean, if you're living a normal life, I live a very normal life. I've got 3 kids, 5 grandkids, lived in the same town pretty much all my life since I was 6 years old. So people know me. I have a reputation in the community. If you want to live a normal life, it's hard to hide all your assets and all your money. And it just takes too much effort to do it. It's sort of like people that want to avoid paying all taxes, so they go out of their way never to get involved in a transaction that causes them to pay taxes. That just takes too much effort. I pay some taxes. I try to pay as little as possible. I have, and we'll talk about some asset protection strategies that I use here. But we don't go overboard, and we don't get involved in something that's so complicated that we don't understand it and we can't explain it to somebody else. So if you're approached by somebody or somebody thinks they have a genius idea for protecting your assets, but you don't understand it
Yeah.
and they can't explain it to you, obviously that's a red flag. You want to stay away from that type of technique.
Got it. So pretty soon here, I want to there's a list of 7 things that I picked up from you, 7 different ways that we could try to do some simple asset protection. But before we do that, we're talking about protection. You've brought up this idea to me of risk, or just thinking about, like, what are the bad things that actually happen? And you did this exercise where you said, ask yourself these questions. I'm just going to give a list of things that you told me. Okay. Say, here's possible things that could go wrong. And so I want everybody listening too, like, which one of these seems most likely, which one of these things seems the most costly, the thing that would be like really bad if it happened. So a tenant lawsuit, a tax audit, a loan foreclosure, a lawsuit from somebody you sold a property to who says, hey, you gave me a lemon, this is a bad property. A lawsuit from somebody you hired to do work for you, a roofer, and they fell off the roof or something, and they sued you because they got hurt. A government agency who filed an action or a lawsuit against you, or some other kind of accident that was your fault and somebody deemed it was your fault.
Let's throw in there partnerships. Right?
Partnerships, that's the other one.
So my advice for a long time is stay married. If you get unmarried, you'll find that that's a very expensive mistake you made, and no matter how you try to hide your assets, probably that's not going to work. You're going to end up with half as much, if you're lucky, as you started with. And the same thing with business partnerships. I've had a couple business partners who got in trouble. They got financial problems or they got legal problems. When that happens, that affects your life. So just adding that one more point to your list there.
Yeah, 100%. The takeaway I had from that is, I think a lot of people I talk to who they're worried about asset protection, they're almost always thinking the tenant, and they're saying, well, I don't want the tenant to sue me. And you pointed out it's not foolproof, but that's actually much more rare than partnerships breaking up. And it's also rare. The biggest risk that I took away lesson from you is the only way to go get the main way that we people get a foreclosure or go bankruptcy is having bank loans, is actually having institutional loans. It has nothing to do with asset protection, but that's one of the ways people lose money. So I think there's just kind of this miscalculation of risk and of what the worst things that are happening are. And both you and I, the people we know who've had a lot of bad experiences in real estate, is for a lot of other reasons other than things that an LLC or some kind of asset protection thing is going to help you from. And I just want to make that point. That was such a big aha for me, hearing you go down that list and kind of pointing out which things are actually risky and which things aren't that risky.
Mm-hmm. And we do all those things. If you're in business, you're going to have all those experiences where you hire people, where you buy and sell property, where you manage property. So just reducing the volume and hopefully dealing with people who are not litigious on the other side. You get to choose who you do business with, and if you think they're going to, their response is, we're going to sue you, don't do business with those people.
Yeah. Well, so let's go down a list. I'm going to say the item, and then I'm just going to let you explain what you mean by it. The first strategy to try to minimize risk was to minimize the number of transactions you had, and you talked a little bit about this, but maybe you could explain more why that's a big deal.
Well, in my entire career, I probably owned about 100 properties, but that's over, call it 50 years, make the math simple. So I bought about 2 properties a year for 50 years. If you keep your volume that low, you're probably not going to make many mistakes. I have a student who was just with me here that we do a class out in Colorado once a year, and he does 40 transactions a year. Well, if you get involved in 40 deals a year, you just know that some of those are going to go wrong. There's going to be a mistake in there someplace. And just one bad one can wipe you out. One bad mistake can tie you up. And, part of asset protection strategy, I think, is understanding that if you ever have a problem, it's just a negotiation. When McDonald's gets sued for $30 million because somebody spills coffee in their lap, they don't write them a check for $30 million. They talk about it for a while. They'll appeal. They'll negotiate until they get it down to a reasonable amount. And so if you're not that you're McDonald's, but if you're in a position where if somebody does threaten to sue you, you can say, well, what's the worst case scenario here? Do we have insurance that covers this? And if we don't have insurance, if we're exposed to this, do we have assets that are protected from this particular lawsuit? And so, if you are married, or if you have children, if you have financial partners or financial friends, people you're in business with, all these people are resources to you. I took a class years ago, and the guy said, it doesn't have to be your money if you have access to the money. So if your kids have a lot of money and you get in trouble, your kids probably aren't going to get sued, so they can lend you money, or they can get back in business with you. So it's just an interesting thought that you don't have total exposure of all your assets. And the house you live in the state of Florida, for example, has some asset protection, and then it does in many states. Your retirement plans have asset protection and federal. So if you have some money in a Roth IRA or a 401k, that's probably fairly safe money. So there's some money you can have to allow you to survive a long-term negotiation without just caving in and paying a large amount. So remember, it's going to be a negotiation if somebody does come after you. And the first step is, to see if it's real or not. I've only had one tenant call me over the years and said they're going to sue me. I said, well, who's your lawyer? Well, that stopped the conversation right there. They didn't have a lawyer. They were just going to sue me. And they were just talking. They were just talking.
So number one was minimize transactions, and you just went to another one, which it was another important one. Which let's just call that number two is separate ownership. So you just mentioned a few ideas. You could own it personally. You could have an LLC own it. You could have a kid own a property or two. You could have your Roth IRA.
Hold on now. I didn't say have a kid own a property or two, but I mean that if the kids are old enough, they can. But don't put property in your children's names if they're 12.
Right.
Because they can't borrow against it or loan it. Or sell it back to anybody else.
I'm thinking more in your situation when you have adult kids, or like I'm thinking about the Walmart Foundation. Is they had a partnership where lots of kids in the family who had grown adult kids were owning properties or owning business. Yeah. So, and then the other mention was a retirement account. So I thought that was interesting too, to think about. A lot of people's assets are in retirement accounts. So making loans, doing other real estate transactions out of a retirement account is a whole separate bucket of your assets.
And it's a little bit off topic, but you can have more than one retirement account. So if you, for any reason, we're going to get into a risky deal, you might want to set up a separate retirement account so that the assets just of that account would be at risk, not your other accounts.
Got it. All right. So we minimize transactions, separate ownership. A third one that you touched on a little bit too is insurance. So do you have just any basics that you try to do in your own rental business with insurance?
Well, we carry liability insurance, which is really like prepaid legal fees, because if you do get sued and you have a liability policy, then depends on why you're sued. And the policy won't protect you against everything. So if you have a liability policy, take the time to read it. And if you don't understand it, talk to your insurance people to make sure you do understand it. If you punch somebody in the nose, it probably doesn't protect you. If you discriminate, it probably doesn't protect you. So there's things that you can insure against and things that you cannot insure against.
I did something, John. This is the sign of the times, though. But I put my liability insurance policy into ChatGTP last week, and I said, "Give me a list of questions that I should be talking to my insurance agent about, or tell me like which one of these which things am I insured for, which one am I not." And I just had this discussion with AI, and then I went back to my insurance agent and said, "Hey, how come I'm not insured for this and this? And let's talk about that." So just another idea, just talking about understanding your insurance policy. Not many of us, I think I have found, actually do understand all the details of it. So whether it's a human being or AI or whoever, you got to understand what's actually written there, because I promise you the insurance company understands. They know what they insure and what they don't, but not many of us do.
Yeah. And, if you have different entities, you have to make sure they're covered. So that may require more than one insurance policy.
Yep. So another thing you've sort of alluded to just with your style of business, John, but I want to point out is that another item for minimizing risk is just having knowledge about the subjects you're working in, knowledge about the laws of your local laws, your national laws. Do you want to say anything else about that? How not having more knowledge actually reduces your risk in your business?
Well, yeah, and you've all heard that a lack of knowledge of the law is no defense, and most of us are not going to go to law school and study the law where we really understand it, but you should understand the part of the law that affects you. So what's going to affect you? Tenant landlord laws, local code enforcement laws, zoning laws, to take it up a level, tax laws. If you're dealing with the government, they have a lot more power than any tenant will ever have. I mean, they can do things to you that, people who are just suing you all they can do is get a judgment against you. The IRS can freeze your accounts. So, and the code enforcement guys can shut you down. I mean, they can red tag your property so you can't rent it. So you have to understand the people that you're dealing with or the entities you're dealing with on a regular basis. You have to understand their rules and know enough about them and have good counsel. I have a CPA I've used for years. I have other attorneys I use all the time. If you're going to be in this business, you're going to have expenses to get professional advice sometimes, or at least you should. You should be getting professional advice. And if you're not, you're taking a chance there, because if the IRS comes after you, there's not as many defenses as if just a tenant sues you.
They call that the superior creditor, or what? I forget the term, but where the IRS will always be ahead of every other creditor, right? They're gonna get their money.
Well, and your local tax people too. I mean, you got to pay your taxes. And there's a lot of things you need to take care of. There's a lot of details in this business, and it's not the fun side of the business, but you have to take care of the details. You have to file your tax returns. You have to pay your property taxes. You need to have, if you have loans, if you have loans to banks, you're going to have insurance, and that's one reason that I've for years tried to avoid banks. I've never borrowed money from a bank to buy a house for a lot of reasons, but one of them is the insurance.
Well, let's talk about leverage. That was one of my next ones on the list. So reducing your risk by paying attention to how you borrow money, what type of leverage you can use. Could you give just some feedback on that one?
Well, like I said a second ago, I think this is probably the one category of risk that puts more people out of business than any other category. It's easy to buy property with leverage. If you go to the bank, if you have good credit and you want to sign the paperwork that the bank makes you sign, you can probably borrow 80% against a house. Well, 80% is a lot. That's a lot of leverage. If you buy from somebody selling you the house, there's a good chance you can buy it for less than 20% down. But when you owe 80% or more on a property, you're on thin ice to start with. I mean, you've got to do everything else right now. You've got to collect the rent, because all of your rent's going to go to making payments. And if you let that house sit empty, you're probably going to lose it. Or if you have a major repair on that house, you may well lose it unless you have money in the bank. So that's the highest risk thing you do is leveraging property, but it's also the most profitable thing we do. So learning how to do it well, learning how to do it safely, borrowing from people that may work with you. For example, I've used private investors. If we had a downturn and I was having trouble paying my private investors, I'm sure I could work out a situation where we could delay some of the payments or give them part interest in the property. There's different things we could negotiate that I couldn't negotiate if it was a bank. The problem with banks you have if there's a downturn and you can't make your payments is they're typically not very flexible. Sometimes they are, but typically they're not.
So what I'm hearing you say, I mean, a lot of people are going to have to get institutional loans to start. Maybe they get a down payment on their home they live in, and then they move out and they keep it as a rental. But over time, what I'm hearing is that's a risky place to be in. So eventually you want to get out of that situation, either pay your loans down, pay them off, get a private lender, because then when you're thinking about your long-term risk, you have to borrow the money to get started and to grow, but eventually maybe a mature portfolio has less of that, less bank debt, less leverage. Is that what you're saying as well?
Well, sure. I think your goal and what I've encouraged people to think about is owning a portfolio of free and clear houses at some point in their life. And that probably takes a while for most people, unless you start off with a lot of money. But, I started off with no money. And after years, I was able to pay off a number of my properties. So having some free and clear properties gives me that safety net if we had a recession, because they will always have cash flow. If you think about it, the properties that have the most cash flow are your free and clear properties. Even a house with a 30% loan on it still has a payment. But once you pay that loan off, now you have a lot of cash flow from that one property. So having one or two or three properties paid for gives you that safety blanket, and you'll have some extra cash flow there, because there are cycles in the world. And more importantly, there's cycles in your life. People read the Wall Street Journal. They really should be reading some other books too, because, staying married, having happy kids, staying healthy, all these things in the long run are absolutely more important than asset protection.
Yep. 100% agree. All right. So a lot more we could say about that, but I want to go to the next one, which you've touched on earlier. But one of the best ways to reduce risk as a rental investor is just being careful about the types of properties you own.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
you wrote a book, Building Wealth One House at a Time. So maybe you
Yes,
could
sir.
talk about why you choose that asset, why you like houses, even 50 years after you started investing.
Yeah. Well, the reason I like houses is because I've owned everything else, and I know that the houses are first of all they're more liquid. So let's say you had five houses instead of one apartment building. If you needed some money, you could sell off one house. And even if you sold it below the market just to get rid of it or hurry, you would still own four other houses. If you had to sell your apartment building at a wholesale price, it'd be gone, and you'd probably take a much larger loss. So they're more liquid than other types of properties. They attract tenants that tend to stay longer. I've managed a lot of apartments and duplexes and a lot of other types of property. The tenants come and go. I just lost a 42-year tenant in a house, and the reason I lost them is the house flooded. If the house hadn't flooded, they'd still be there, and we'd be going for 50 years. But I've had a lot of 20-year tenants, 25-year tenants, and when you have a tenant stay that long, first of all, it does reduce your risk, but second of all, it doesn't involve much of your time. You're not all the time looking for new tenants, interviewing new tenants, fixing properties up. They just stay in that house. And the people who stayed there 42 years had the original carpet 42 years old. So, it really cuts down on your expenses to own properties that you can rent to people long term. I think they are safer. I think they're as profitable as any other type of investment once you get good at it. And they're available. I've got a good buddy who buys mobile home parks, but sometimes it takes him 4 to 5 years to find one he likes. Well, I can leave here right now, my house, and I'll guarantee you by 5 o'clock, I could find a house that I like that I can buy today. There's always houses out there in good neighborhoods that are available. And now it's up to you to learn enough to learn how to buy them with the assets that you have, with the down payment you have, and the financing you can put together so you can afford to own them. If you buy something with nothing down, one of my students wrote a book called Nothing Down, which is a pretty good book. But if you buy something with nothing down, you owe it all, which means you probably have to struggle to to make the
Yeah.
payments. And I'm not sure that's the best strategy.
Yeah. All right. So there's one other. I love that, by the way, and I'm influenced by that as well. Well, the one of the things that's fresh on my mind, I know your mind as well. We had hurricanes last fall that hit a bunch of people in Florida. They hit people in South Carolina, North Carolina. There's been fires in LA. So I think natural disasters are a risk that's on a lot of people's minds. So when we're thinking about picking houses to buy, so if we like houses, we like them for those reasons. Is there any other thing we could think about, like diversifying which houses we own so that we're not potentially struck by as much by one single natural disaster?
Yeah, yeah. I own four houses on the water here in Sarasota, and we had a lot of water here in Sarasota. But only one of those four flooded, interestingly enough. Uh, the other three are on the water. They're not much higher than that was, but the storm was relatively focused on one part of our community. So a couple of them, three of them did not flood. One of them did. So at your point to diversity, yeah, but if you just had one building, the one building could flood, or the one building could have a fire, or the one building could have a problem. They're about to tear up a road down the street here. If you had a business on this road and they tear it up, and they're talking about 36 months, that's going to affect your business. So you want to be diversified, and the benefit in the house business is I buy houses for different reasons. The houses I buy on the water, for example, I buy just because the appreciation is greater on those houses. The cash flow is not very good. The appreciation is greater. I buy other houses because the cash flow is very good. So if you had five houses, you might buy four of them for more cash flow, and one of them you might buy just because you think it's going to go way up in value because of its location. So you get to kind of target different houses for different reasons. And of course, every one of those has different kinds of financing on them. Sometimes you get interest only, sometimes you get principal only, sometimes you get a low interest rate, sometimes you get a higher interest rate but a better price. So you get to negotiate more. And I like that part of the business. I like buying things. I don't like selling much. I don't sell very often, but I do like transactional negotiation. So if I'm either negotiating with a tenant to rent them a house, or a lender to borrow some money, or somebody I'm buying a house from, or somebody I'm selling a house to, I think those opportunities are first of all, they're fun for me. And second of all, they're generally very profitable, because if it's not profitable for me, I'm not going to say yes.
Yep. Yeah. So what I think is interesting, a lot of people think diversification, they think, all right, 5 cities in the United States. But what I'm hearing you
Oh,
say is you've tried that one too, right?
I was probably in 10 states once. I can tell you that's not a good idea.
Yeah. So just having properties in different parts of the same town
I think it makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you
Got
can
it.
have more than one town if you want to. If you live in downtown New York City, you might want to buy stuff in a different part of town. But most of us live, I know where you live, you know where I live. We live in our kind of normal towns. So there's always opportunities in these towns to buy in better neighborhoods or
Yeah.
different neighborhoods as time goes on.
Okay. All right, so we're almost at number 7 here of this list. So we have 7 ways you can simple ways that you can reduce the risk as a rental investor. I'm just going to read these off. And by the way, I have a free download you can have. You just want to have a summary of these while you're watching this. There'll be a link in the YouTube and podcast description below. But number 1, minimize transactions. Number 2, separate ownership. Number 3, look at liability insurance. Number 4, increase your knowledge, either your own knowledge or borrow knowledge from an attorney, a CPA. Number 5, use leverage wisely. Number 6, invest in houses and lower risk assets. All right, so those are our first 6, but my favorite is number 7. And you don't hear any other real estate people say this, but number 7 is to spend the money and give it away. What do you mean by that?
Well, I've got a little more life experience than most people have, I think. But what I've learned is once I spend money, either taking, as you have done too, taking my kids around the world, let them live different places, and really experience the world in different ways that most people get to experience. Those trips, I'm about to take a ski trip with 9 people in the Snowmass for a week. I won't tell you what that costs, but you can kind of guess. That money spent, one has spent, nobody else can ever get it back. It's safe money in my mind. So money that you spend or give away or you just enjoy, that's money that first of all, nobody can make you pay back, and second of all, it's a fun part of life. So I encourage people to, if I sign a book for you, I always write in there, build wealth, enjoy it, and then share it. And you can share your wealth not only by writing people checks, but by what you're doing right here. You can help them by teaching them a better way maybe to invest, a safer way to invest, better for everybody, better for your tenants, better for you, better for people you buy from and sell to, just a better way to do it.
Well, I find that philosophy so refreshing, and I appreciate that wisdom and the lessons you've taught over the years. It's influenced me a good bit, so I really appreciate it. And I know other people are going to take it to heart as well. And if they wanted to follow up with you, John, and connect with you, you don't do as much live teaching as you used to, but if they wanted to find out what you're up to, your website's johnschaub.com.
JohnSchaub.com and Peter Fortunato and I will do a class. We generally teach once a year. It'll be April 5th and 6th this year in Tampa, Florida. So you can get on my website and see the information on that. And I've recorded a number of courses, and they're on that website too. So if you want more information on specific areas, I'm happy to help you.
Well, if I go to a live event, it's typically with John or Pete. Those are the ones I like to learn from. So definitely recommend it. And John, thanks for your time and for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you, Chad. Okay. Take care.
In this episode, John and I recommended you keep your real estate investing small and simple. You might be wondering, how can I achieve all my financial goals with a small number of properties? If that's you, then I highly recommend my next video, which is all about how to become financially free with 5 small and simple rental properties. In that video, I'm going to give you a case study drawing on a whiteboard where I go in detail to explain how you do that. If you're watching on YouTube, just click on the thumbnail above me here. Or if you're listening on the podcast or watching on YouTube, you can click on the link in the description below. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next episode.